With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome into Tactics. We are so pleased to have you here, whether you're joining us on YouTube, on Twitch, on Facebook Live, on Periscope, or Twitter. However you're getting the show, we certainly appreciate you being a part of our program here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. And those three axioms, we're going to have to remember those a lot in this particular episode, because there is an awful lot of people that do not believe in those three things, and we're going to talk an awful lot about that today. Got a lot coming up on the show, but before I get into anything else on this Thursday, I do want to talk about yesterday. Of course, yesterday I wasn't able to have a show. I had too much to do with my meeting with the Ukraine and had to do everything with Bible study, so it just became too much. And even though I already have an abridged show on Wednesday anyway, I decided that there just was no way for me to pull all of that off. But there were just a couple thoughts I wanted to have, because I'm not the kind of person that has the ability to do some kind of big sweeping video testament to it like a lot of the other big national shows do. And that's okay, but I don't even necessarily want to present something to you as much as I want to ask you some questions and have you really think about it, do a little soul searching, and try to come up with an answer, because I think these are interesting questions. And one of the big questions is, how is 9/11 going to be remembered by people who didn't live through it? Because I genuinely wonder about that. Now, with me, I was a child when 9/11 happened. I was in middle school. But right now I'm 30 years old. This was the 18th year anniversary of 9/11. And right now I'm 30. And I work at Faulkner University, and a lot of the students that I have primarily freshmen. I have some non-freshmen, some upperclassmen that are in one of the dorms over there, but primarily I deal almost exclusively with freshmen. And when you think about it, there's an awful lot of my students, maybe not a majority, but primarily not based on the year, but the month that they were born in. I have a pretty large amount of my students that either were not born when 9/11 happened, or were not very old, not even a year old, when 9/11 happened, so they don't have any memories of it. They may have memories of seeing the footage after the fact, but they don't remember the event actually occurring. And so it's really interesting to get to talk to some young people and have some conversations with them about 9/11 from the perspective of somebody who doesn't have any direct memories of it. You see, they don't have anything pre 9/11 to compare it to. You and I do. But there is an increasing amount of people that don't. And this isn't the first wave, the first year of people that have that, because let's be honest, if you were 3 or 4 when 9/11 happened, you don't really remember it. You don't really have a recollection of pre 9/11 United States versus post 9/11 United States. And I don't think that 9/11 has necessarily been the only factor that has steered politics or our culture or any of that. But I think it's really important to understand the impact that it had on the world and that it continues to have on us to this day, because in certain ways 9/11 feels like yesterday, and in certain ways it feels like a far distant memory. And one of the things that I didn't realize until just recently, and really brought it into new light for me, the world changing impact that 9/11 had. Did you know that the Patriot Act was not written in response to 9/11? It was passed and implemented as a response to 9/11, but it was not written as a response to 9/11. The Patriot Act came up through the Clinton administration in the 90s. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not pinning it on Bill Clinton. He's not the person that wrote it. I'm just saying that was the era in which it came up, because people have mistakenly tried to attribute the Patriot Act and the practices therein to one party or the other. Some people have tried to say that it was all Bush's mess, and that's what came from George W. Bush and his administration. Then people have tried to attribute it to Obama because he took it further with the NSA spying. We know the infamous interviews with guys like James Clapper where they swore up and down they were not spying, and then it turns out they were. So I think that we've done a disservice by making it a partisan issue. But I want to really get you to think about that, because if that was not written as a response to 9/11, it lets you know that there were people in the government that liked the idea of having secret courts and having, just the government take people out based on things that happen not in the sunlight, not out in the open. And they had plans to spy on you all along. They just used 9/11 as a catalyst. They used our fear, they used our insecurity about what could happen after seeing the horrors, the real horrors, and the legitimate fear that people had after 9/11. It's not that it was unfounded, but they used that as a way to take freedom from us. And sadly, that has been the terrorist goal all along. They knew that taking down the World Trade Center was going to be devastating to this country, but they knew it wasn't going to undo it. But that's the thing about terrorism. Its whole purpose is not to change us or to destroy us from the outside, but to get us whipped up into a frenzy, to be fearful, and to allow that fear to destroy us from within. And when you compare the military might of the United States to really any force on Earth, but especially those in the Middle East that don't have the same technology and military capabilities, their only shot is terrorism. Because they know that the only thing that they can do is to create an insurgence, to create something that causes us to collapse within ourselves. It's not going to come from the outside. And so, in many ways, and the Patriot Act is one example of many policies that this could apply to. In many ways, the terrorist won. We made a lot of changes based on fear in the wake of 9/11. And I just want us to be aware of that and to really consider that, and also help give us some guidance for the future, that maybe when we're fearful and have a high level of anxiety and right after some kind of tragedy has taken place, that's really the worst time to make decisions, because we tend to make bad ones. That could be said of the Patriot Act, that could be said of the war in Iraq. There's a myriad of things that we have done in response to 9/11 and the well-founded fear that we had, that we were not thinking about it clearly or in a way that brought a beneficial effect. And that brings me to my next question and segues very nicely into it. How have we changed? And by that, even though I've been focusing primarily on the government, I've been focusing primarily on policies, that kind of thing. How have we changed in the wake of 9/11 as people? Because I think that's the most terrifying thing of all. Again, I'm not saying that 9/11 was the only catalyst to this, but to give you a brief history lesson, I think this is a pretty good explanation of how a lot of this stuff took place. Not all of it, but a lot of where we are right now and how 9/11 had an effect on that. In the wake of 9/11, what happened to a lot of people, myself included, is that because we wanted to react to it in a positive way to show that America was still strong, that we could not be broken, that even though our hearts were broken, our soul and our will was not, we wrapped ourselves in the flag. And I'm not saying that is a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. I love patriotism. I mean, I have just right over there, I know you can't see it because it's not on camera, but I have the Declaration of Independence. On another wall, I've got Captain America's shield. On another wall, I've got a giant American flag. I'm very pro flag. I love America. I love the symbolism of America, but I'm just trying to give you an observation of what happened, not necessarily commenting on the goodness or badness of it. What we did was we wrapped ourselves in the flag. And I think that most Americans did that, right and left, regardless of their political affiliation. Of course, there were some fringe lunatics that didn't. But the vast majority of the American people, they didn't think of ourselves as Republicans or Democrats. We just wanted to show our pride for this country. And because of that, we wrapped ourselves in the flag. Then, after a couple of years, especially when you're looking at about the 2004-2005 era, then a sentiment started creeping in that we were not in Iraq for the right reasons. And it was a sentiment that was not completely unfounded. I mean, you could Monday morning quarterback. I still believe that, and because of the evidence that I've seen, that Iraq was at the very least trying to get nuclear weapons. Now, whether or not we should have gotten involved in a quagmire like that over that is a completely different discussion. But regardless, what happened is there was this back and forth between the right and left about whether or not we should have gone into Iraq. And unfortunately, we started to back into our corners. And what happened with that is the people on the right saw the people on the left that were being skeptical of the war, being skeptical of the reasons that we were there, trying to place blame on things like Dick Cheney being a warmonger and war profiteering and all these other really horrible things. And the right looking at that and sort of painting with a broad brush and saying, no, if you're against the war, it's because you have forgotten about 9/11 and you don't care about America. You don't have any national pride. And at this point, remember, we're still wrapped around in that flag. We're still kind of on a patriotism high, as it were, which is not evil in and of itself. Don't misunderstand me here. But because of that, the left, they reacted to that and saw, oh, well, the people that are wrapped in the flag, they don't really mean what they say about things like free speech and having a difference of opinion and coming to the table. They believe in the flag more than they believe in the principles underlying America. And to be honest, there were probably some people on the right that fit that bill. There were probably at least some, if not a lot, of people on the right that fit that mold that really they were a lot more enamored with the stars and stripes than they were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Unfortunately, that's true for a lot of people. That it's more about the window dressing than the principles underlying what the flag stands for. And so the flag honestly kind of became toxic to the left, or a lot of people on the left. Not all of them, but a lot of people on the left, not even necessarily if they saw just the flag, but if they saw somebody that wrapped themselves in the flag and Americanism, they started to see that as a negative. And the further on in the Obama years, and I'm not necessarily blaming Obama for this, even though I think he does share at least partial blame. I mean, the way that he constantly apologized for everything America's ever done, the way that he acted as though he was ashamed of our history, the way that Michelle said we have to change our history and our traditions because the ones that we have now are bad. That was a reaction to the right sort of oversaturating everything with patriotism. and claiming that you're a bad person if you disagree with the war effort. You're a bad person if you disagree with the American government, and that makes you not American and not a patriot. So you see how this thing just kind of ratcheted up? That you had one side react and then the other side reacted to that and went further, and the pendulum swung further and further in each direction when that happened. And so now we've gotten to a place where a lot of people on the left, unfortunately, believe that America is rotten from the core, that from root to branch, everything that America has is based on something that is wrong, that the flag is an actual symbol of oppression and evil. And we've got people on the right that cling to the flag and, again, don't think that that's incorrect. But they do so, I think, sometimes at the expense of remembering what the flag actually represents. And so that's really important to understand how we've changed. And maybe you have some other ideas about how we've changed, or maybe you have some issues with my analysis of it. And if you do, that's fine. I'm open to hearing some other alternative theories. But that's just kind of how I see it, and how 9/11 really sort of shook the culture of both the right and the left, and started to drive us apart. And that, again, segues into my final question here. What would happen if 9/11 happened today? If we had another 9/11-esque event, a terrorist attack on this country, and it occurred either in one of our major cities, New York, LA, Chicago, Dallas, something like that. If that occurred and we lost about 3,000 Americans, how would we react? Because we're different people than we were then. I know how we reacted the first time. I just gave a little hint at it, but we came together. We were praying with one another. Nobody met a stranger. It was the most united we had been in my entire lifetime. And to be honest, probably the only people that saw some similarities between it and another event are the people that were alive during Pearl Harbor. That's probably the only other time in American history, at least, that people would still be alive for. Because, of course, you could say that we were more united at other times in the Revolution, for example, even though I think that even then that wouldn't be the case. If you look at the writings of the time, it suggests that we were very divided during the Revolution. But anyway, I think that that may be the only time in American history that we came together as much as we did, and there was that much agreement, that much patriotism, that much goodwill towards our fellow citizens. And unless you actually lived through that day, unless you were alive in the 1930s and 40s and saw pre-Pearl Harbor how America was then and how America was post-Pearl Harbor and then into World War II, I'm not sure that you really have anything to compare it to. Maybe the JFK assassination, but again, I wasn't alive for that, so I'm not sure. But I know how we reacted then. The question is, would an event like that, on that scale, that level of tragedy, that was a very clear attack not just on people, but America as a whole, would that unite us the way that 9/11 did? Because I'm not so sure. I know that we had our differences and disagreements pre 9/11, and maybe I'm looking back at the past with rose colored glasses, but I just don't think that we were nearly as far apart. And the way that we react to things like mass shootings and terrorist attacks now, frankly, I'm worried that it would actually divide us more than unite us. Now, granted, to some degree, we are united by natural disasters. Now, there are some nut jobs that claim that Donald Trump causes hurricanes, or that there was relief efforts that were given to some people because of the color of their skin and not others, which is absurd. But I mean, you even had that back in Katrina with Kanye West. That's been going on for a long time, and I don't think that's something that is shared by the bulk of the American population. But I think that this is a legitimate question because I'm just not so sure that we would be able to unite the way that we did at one time. If we had another 9/11 event, to be honest, I'm afraid that we would be so eager to use it as a political bludgeon against the people who disagree with us that it wouldn't matter. That we would be at one another's throats trying to blame the other party for why this took place. Whether it was Donald Trump's foreign policy or whether it was saying that the left was too soft on uh, Muslim terrorism and that they allowed it. I think that you really would see us go to our corners again and try to blame the tragedy, blame the event on the other side. And that really is a tragedy. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I hope we don't have to find out. But the truth is, at this point, I'd seriously have to question it. And if I had to guess, I would say that an event like this would divide us more than it would unite us. And that is a sign of a sick nation, a nation that is not healthy and that will not be able to sustain itself if we don't do something pretty drastic. If we can't come together as a people on an issue like this, to be frank, I don't know that we would survive another 9/11, not because of the casualties would be something that would cripple us, but because of the way we would react. And in that same vein, we'll go ahead and we'll just jump to a break, and then we'll come back because I'll tell you what, I think that this story has a lot to do with what I just talked about. So I'm just going to go ahead and give some commentary on it. For those of you who don't know, there is some local news going on today where Opelika High, Opelika right next to Auburn University, they're kind of twin cities. If you've ever lived there, you can barely tell one from the other. But when you're looking at Opelika, their high school, and I do have some association with Opelika High. They have the state contest for FFA there. My roommate was an Opelika High graduate while I was in college. So I'm not, nearly as familiar with it as a graduate would be, I'm sure. But I do have some connection to Opelika High and have been on the campus many, many times. They announced that this Friday, so tomorrow, at their game, that they are not going to issue a prayer before the football game, that instead they're just going to have a moment of silence and people can pray, silently if they want to, but they are not going to have an actual prayer take place on the football field. And I see this as being really upsetting, and especially the way that it happened. Because one parent, complained on August 22nd, so just a couple weeks ago, that they were leading with a prayer, that's how they were starting the football game. And because this one parent had an issue with it, they reached out to the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is a group based out of Wisconsin. It's very common for them to deal with issues like this. Whenever there's a school teacher praying somewhere, they feel that they have to get involved for some reason. And I actually have run into their founder a couple of times, so real familiar with them. They wrote a letter saying that it is against federal law for the high school to actually engage in school-sponsored prayer. In other words, the school can't put it on, is what they said. And they just straight up said, okay, well, we're going to stop it and we'll have a moment of silence instead. This was the quickest cave I have ever seen in one of these cases. Now, I have no idea whose call this was. I'm not sure if it was Opelika High School's principal or the athletic director or the county school board there in Lee County. I'm not sure how that took place, but this is the fastest cave I've ever seen. I mean, it was basically immediate. That as soon as they got the letter, yep, not doing that anymore. And I do think that this story is a perfect little microcosm of everything that is wrong with the country now. And I'm not trying to overstate it or be a shock jock or anything like that, but hear me out on this. Not to say that them stopping school in one high school is the biggest problem in the country, but I think it's a perfect little example or a parable of what the nation's problem really is. A person in a gathering, and Opelika High is a 6A school, they've gone to the state championship before. There's a lot of people at that game, hundreds, if not thousands. One person has a problem with it, and they start to raise a stink. And then somebody else way off who is completely unaffected by it in any meaningful way, which basically is the way that Twitter works, they react to this whole thing and they raise a fuss and threaten the high school there. And the high school immediately, because they don't want to be dragged into court and they don't want the bad press, they immediately cave without ever actually fighting back or at least explaining themselves. They automatically admit defeat and run away with their tail between their legs. Which indicates to me either they didn't really want to fight this fight, in other words, they weren't really married to the idea of starting a football game out with a prayer, or they're just so spineless that they did want it, but they didn't want it near enough to have to actually fight for it. Neither one of those options are good options. But ultimately, this is where you run into issues. That in this little story, you have essentially everything that's wrong with America, because isn't that the issue that we're having now? One person or a very small group of people gets very offended at something ridiculous, and then they bring it to other people that are completely unconnected to the story, completely in a situation where they'll never have to deal with a situation like this from this specific group. They're not only not from Opelika, they're not even from the same part of the country, would never be affected by this. They raise a stink, despite there being zero chance of them ever having to deal with this at Opelika High School. And then immediately, the school throws their hands up. They give in. They surrender. They capitulate. And now, no more prayers before football games. And as a religious person as I am, I don't think you necessarily have to have a prayer before a football game. I don't think that God's going to be angry with you if you don't pray before you play a game of football. But I don't think that people should be forced, for the comfort of one person, to abandon a tradition that they love and they want. And of course, there's the legal argument too that schools are run by the states are not beholden to the Bill of Rights. And so even if you could live in this wacky, crazy world that liberals live in, that if you have freedom of religion, somehow that means that you can't pray anywhere in a state-run organization. Even if that were the case, that's still nullified by the fact this isn't a federal institution, it's a state institution. So it's not even beholden to the First Amendment in that case anyway. However, even if you ignore all of that, what's hilarious to me is this is the exact opposite of tolerance. This is the furthest thing from tolerance. And this is what they always preach, like, well, you have to be tolerant, you have to be tolerant. The reason that they would say that this needs to take place and prayer should be out of schools is because we have to be tolerant of other people's beliefs. No, you're the one being intolerant if you're this person. You're one person in a group that has a problem with it, and everybody else is fine with it. This is part of their belief system. They like it being there. That's the reason that they haven't complained about it. And it's the reason that the institution exists in the first place. And you're saying, no, I want everybody to do what I would rather have them do. I want everybody to capitulate to my sensitivities. That's the opposite of tolerance. And I've been tolerant in situations like this before. There have been times where I've had, good friends. I don't necessarily consider them spiritual leaders, but I've had friends that were not necessarily of my same religious persuasion pray in ways that I didn't agree with. And I didn't pray along with them because of that. But I also didn't try to stop the prayer from taking place. That's what tolerance looks like. And before you say, well, that was different, it was a private situation, a few times it actually wasn't. It was at an event run by a part of Alabama State Department of Education. And I'm not going to say who because it's really irrelevant and I don't want anybody to get in trouble, especially years and years after the fact, especially by clowns like these. But even though it was something that was against my religion, something that I found to be even blasphemous in one occasion, I still never said anything. I waited quietly for them to finish. I didn't participate, but I also didn't try to inhibit them from practicing their religion in the way that they felt appropriate. And sometimes this happened on government property, on state property, with the blessing of and facilitated by people in said organization. For example, one thing that I believe, I'm not going to get off into the logistics of it, I don't believe that it is right for women to lead men in prayer. Fine for women to lead other women in prayer, and I'm all for women praying, by themselves, but leading in prayer is a wholly different matter. And whether you agree with me or not, that's not really the point of the story. The point is, I believe it's incorrect, and I can give spiritual basis for it, even though that's beyond the scope of what we're doing today. I believe that it's incorrect, but even when it happened, I didn't try to stop the person. I didn't try to inhibit them from praying. I didn't make a fuss or try to go to an authority figure to get them to knock it off. Just waited until it was over. And there's probably people that I've prayed things that they didn't necessarily agree with, and they didn't participate in a spiritual way either. That's fine. That's what tolerance actually looks like. And if we're going to bring this whole thing full circle, I want you to think about 9/11 and the people that we were. Do you really think on the day of 9/12, where people were praying left and right, that even if you had somebody that was an atheist that went to one of these services, even if it was government run and put on by the state or the city or whatever, that if somebody had prayed at one of those events, that said atheists would have gotten their shorts in a bunch and tried to raise Cain about it and get it stopped? I tend to think no. If I were at such an event and they had a Jewish person or a Muslim person offer up a prayer, I don't agree with it. I think they're wasting their breath, but I'm not going to try to get them to stop. And that's another part of tolerance, being able to recognize goodwill. Now, tolerance also means tolerating some things of people that are of bad will. That's the harder part of that. But do you really think that I would turn down the prayers of somebody that is Jewish or Muslim or even Hindu, if that's something that they would practice, in regards to offering help and comfort to those that are suffering? Or if they were praying for me, I may not necessarily think that it's doing anything, but that does not mean that I don't at least recognize the goodwill and appreciate it. And so, going back to this idea of how we've changed, I think that this Opelika High moment unfortunately shows how much we've changed and how far we've come from the day after 9/11, 9/12, to where we are right now. We're constantly at each other's throats, and it's not healthy, and it's not a good sign for our country. We'll take a break. We'll be back in a minute.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. Now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will come from Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting the fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out of the presence of the Lord, which created a wicked cool light show for them to see and totally got everyone feeling the Spirit's presence. Then Moses said to Aaron, "It is what the Lord spoke, saying, even though I didn't command you to use this strange fire, I totally understand your need to express yourselves in worship and keep yourselves entertained." So Aaron therefore danced and yelled with joy, knowing that his sons were having a good time at worship. Moses called out to Mishael and Ezaphan, and the son of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come forward, carry your relatives away in front of the sanctuary outside of the camp, for they have fainted from being overwhelmed by the power of God's coolness." So they came forward and carried them still in their tunics outside the camp, as Moses had said. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not uncover your heads, nor tear your clothes, because God wants us to always be happy, and as long as we're happy, He's happy. Therefore, if worship doesn't give you an overwhelming sense of euphoria, you need to find another congregation, preferably one with a more dynamic pastor and band." So they did according to the word of Moses. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the sanctuary, so that you will be able to drink more once you arrive. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, because when worship stops being fun or feels judgy, then it becomes profane and unclean." Wow, so inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
Welcome back, all. Thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics. And our next story is, I think, the most important story that virtually nobody is talking about. And just looking over, I was only able to find the story on a handful of sites, and two of them were specifically sites that do news about abortion and the issue of life, and one of the other ones was just a conservative news site. I have not seen any reporting on this anywhere in the mainstream media. Now, maybe they've posted something and I'm incorrect on that. And if you find something from, I don't know, the Hill, WAPO, The Guardian, the New York Times, something like that, I'm willing to correct myself. That's fine. I'm just saying that as of this reading, I couldn't find anything about this from any of the mainstream news sites. So this is sort of a response. In fact, it's the court proceeding that came out of the story that you remember broke a couple of years ago about Planned Parenthood selling baby parts. And they were doing so specifically to a company known as STEM Express. So this past week in court hearings, STEM Express admitted to Planned Parenthood selling them harvested baby parts. And remember, this was all taking place in a courtroom under oath. That's the context in which this occurs. You may remember that CMP, in other words, the Center for Medical Progress, the group of people that did the undercover sting video that unearthed this thing, that unearthed this scandal taking place within the walls of Planned Parenthood. They did that video where Planned Parenthood was caught admitting to harvesting parts illegally and doing so specifically for profit. So that's what was going on here, and that's illegal for two different reasons. First of all, it is illegal to alter procedure for any reason other than the patient's well-being. So when you're talking about an abortion, there are laws in place that if you alter the procedure in any way, and that alteration of procedure is not being done for the well-being of the patient, in this case the mother, because of course they don't consider the child a human being, if they alter the procedure to be able to harvest the baby in order to make money off of it, that is a very clear violation. And so that's the first law that's being broken. The second is that it is illegal to transport body parts for medical use across state lines. And so they were actually moving this stuff from one state to the other, and they were able to prove that this was occurring in some of the cases. I don't think all of the cases, but in some of the cases that they did the sting videos. And so even if the altering procedure had not been taking place, simply moving the part from one state to the other without proper authorization or a proper license, that is a violation of federal law as well. So you're dealing with two violations of law that potentially come out of this court case. And getting off of the legal side of it for just a second, let's just go right to logic and ration here. Here's one thing that I find fascinating about it, because we're so used to, in the pro-choice side of this, we're so used to hearing, well, it's not a baby, it's not a human. And that's the justification for it. We say, no, it is a human life. And they'll say, no, it's not a baby, it's not human. If it's not human, why is Planned Parenthood selling the parts for medical research? That's the thing that sticks in my craw about all this. Because if it's not human, then why not use a rat? They're paying an awful lot of money and going to an awful lot of trouble to do experiments on something for it not being human. Because if they just needed something that wasn't human, that didn't have human DNA and human body parts, which of course we know if we're talking about an unborn child, of course they do. If it's not human, which is central to Planned Parenthood's argument of why abortion should be allowed, why are they selling the parts? To do research to benefit humans because the baby is what? A human baby who, biologically speaking, is far more similar to a adult human or any human that would need medical care that would benefit from this research. They are far more genetically and biologically similar to a human being than animals would be, which is the reason they're willing to pay so much and to sell these parts the way that they are. So just a little food for thought there. So this is coming directly from Live Action, which was one of the sites that I saw reporting on this. Quote, the CEO of STEM Express took the stand on Thursday in the preliminary hearing against the Center for Medical Progress. Investigators David Dalen and Sarah Merritt, according to CMP, she admitted in court that when a fetal brain is harvested, the head may still be attached to the body, and that STEM Express does indeed harvest and supply fully intact aborted children, because using feticide, such as digoxin, damages the specimens. These children had the potential of being born alive. So there's a couple things to note about this. This feticide, in other words, the chemical that they inject into the baby to kill it, if that is not put in there, there is the potential for the child to actually be born alive, and then they kill it, which is illegal on a number of different levels, because then you're dealing with a preemie outside of the womb. And as ridiculous as it is to make the womb, and whether you're in it or not, the dividing line of whether or not something is a human or something is protected or not, as ridiculous a standard as that is, they're very clearly violating even that standard if they are engaged in the procedure this way. Because then they're basically just inducing birth, and once the baby is born outside and living on its own, then they're killing it. And the reason that they're doing it is so that they can preserve the child for experimentation. And by the way, you want to talk about exploiting women? These women were not receiving money that Planned Parenthood was for the experimentation on their baby. Now, as sick and twisted as it would be to sell off your child for human experimentation, it still would stand to reason that Planned Parenthood doesn't have an awful lot of room to talk when they talk about women's rights and equal pay and all that stuff, when you're literally taking, even if you view it as a part of the woman's body, a part of her body away and then using the money to fill your own coffers. And this pokes a pretty big hole in the lie that abortion is all about women's health, that Planned Parenthood is all about women's health. Because if the health of the woman is the number one primary concern, you would never alter the procedure in any way that might make it more dangerous, less likely to be successful, in such a way just to make money. And that's exactly what Planned Parenthood has admitted to having done. It's the CEO of STEM Express saying that that's how they were delivered. So we have confirmation that Planned Parenthood was indeed altering procedure, putting the health of the mother on the sideline for profit. Pokes a pretty big hole in that lie that they've been peddling for years, that their primary concern is women's health. So let's look at another part of this article. That is an especially gruesome admission, but it begs the question, how did they get these fully intact human children? Peter Breen of the Thomas More Society, which is representing Dalen, one of the guys that did the sting operation, representing Dalen at the hearing, told LifeSite News, if you have a fetus with an intact head and an intact body and intact extremities, that is something that would indicate the child was born alive, and then had their organs cut out of them, or that the child was the victim of an illegal partial birth abortion. Both of these are gruesome and violent acts. Yeah. So what you've got here is two options. If they actually are having intact specimens that are not pulled apart, that are still in one piece, if that is taking place, that really leaves you with only two options. Either you're doing a partial birth abortion, in other words, you're inducing labor, and then before the head gets outside the birth canal, and yes, this is gross, but it's the cruel reality of what abortion is, jabbing a pair of scissors into the back of its head and then extracting it after it dies. Or, even more disturbing, if you can even get more disturbing than that they're actually inducing labor, bringing the child out of the womb, and then killing it once it's out, like I just described. Either way, highly illegal. And by the way, even for the pro-choice movement, against what most of them would consider a good practice when it comes to abortion. Remember that only 13% of Americans, left and right, believe that third trimester abortions should be allowed. Where do you think they would stand on this? The baby actually being born and then killed. But that seems to be what is going on here based on their explanation, which, by the way, all happened under oath in court. Basically, what was going on here is they were performing a birth and then killing the child. They also had Holly O'Donnell, who worked for STEM Express, talk about how they would have babies born alive to harvest fresh organs. So what they were doing here is, the fresher the organ, the more viable it is, the less likely you're going to have an organ that's dead, the more valuable that tissue is. The same is true even for adult humans. That if you're doing some kind of medical experimentation, it's much better to have a body that hasn't had to be preserved, that has been, the person has deceased just a very short time ago, to where the organs still have life in them. And here's a person that actually works for STEM Express attesting to this having happened. That this was something that they were receiving, further lending credibility to the idea that Planned Parenthood and STEM Express broke the law. A witness took the stand Thursday and confirmed intact fetuses were supplied by STEM Express for research purposes. So we have Holly O'Donnell, we have the CEO of STEM Express, and then we have another witness that is also confirming this. And that same witness also confirmed that the documents STEM Express testified to Congress were forged were in fact real. And by the way, presumably, granted we don't know a whole lot about this witness yet, but presumably this witness is a person that worked for STEM Express and hasn't flipped or turned on them, that they're still on the pro-choice side, but had to admit, when asked about these documents, when they were asked directly and put under oath, they had to say, yeah, those weren't forged, those are real. And these are the order forms that you remember came out several months ago that showed and proved that STEM Express was purchasing from Planned Parenthood and that they were engaged in this practice. And one of those order forms specifically says fully intact, which would mean that this is just further evidence that what was happening is that Planned Parenthood was either inducing labor or doing partial birth abortions to present a fully intact baby to STEM Express because that was what they were requesting. And what's even more amazing about this is on that same request, it says same-day delivery, further giving credibility to the witness testimony that we now have, that they were doing this basically on a rush. It was being delivered the same day, and they were ignoring inducing the infanticide, the feticide, the poison that they were putting in the child. They were not doing that and altering the procedure so that they could arrive fresh. I mean, this really does read like some kind of science fiction nightmare, but that's what Planned Parenthood is. So now I want you to put all these pieces together. We have the court testimony that I just told you about, corroborated by several witnesses, all under oath. And you'll remember that this whole thing started when we had video of Planned Parenthood executives talking about it and admitting to it on video in their own words. So we've got the sellers admitting to selling the babies. We've got the buyers now admitting to having bought the babies. And this is corroborated by several different witnesses, by different documents, different orders. There's a paper trail. All of this evidence stacked up to show that this is what was actually taking place. And somehow this is going to be dismissed by many on the left as A, not newsworthy, and B, some kind of right-wing hoax. What more could you ask for? Just say in your own mind. Let's just say this were happening, whether it was or not. Let's just say as a scenario that it was happening. What would you say is the threshold that you would have to meet to prove in your mind, okay, it did actually happen? Because if we're seeing all of this and a person is still denying that it's happening, you can pretty much say with a surety that that person, if you had them sit down and watch it take place, they still wouldn't believe that it was happening. They are immune to facts at this point. There is nothing you can say that would convince them otherwise. But that is what is so tragic about the situation that we're in now, that these people are so desperate to continue to cling on to the right to murder their own children that they will ignore basic facts in front of them. Look, on this issue, you don't have to be pro-life. I think that you should be. I've made arguments for that in the past. But on this particular story, you do not have to be pro-life to be angry with Planned Parenthood about this. You remember that horror show that happened a few years ago with the abortion clinic that was being run by Kermit Gosnell, where the guy was doing all kinds of things that A, put women in danger, and B, were just, absolutely sick and disgusting, like keeping baby parts in jars. We have the disgusting factor and we have the illegal factor both present, just like in the Kermit Gosnell case, right here in the Planned Parenthood case. Even if you're pro-choice, even if you believe that abortion is a constitutional right and that anybody that tries to take that away from you is wrong, even if you're on that side of the argument, you can still look at this and say, yeah, what Planned Parenthood was doing was wrong. What Planned Parenthood did put women's lives at risk. Even if you just care about the woman, could care less about the child, you can still look at this and say, Planned Parenthood ought to pay for this. In the same way that a good police officer looks at a dirty cop and says, I am more upset at this person because he gives cops a bad rep. The pro-abortion side should be the ones that are ringing the warning sign, or ringing the bells and flashing the warning signs more than anybody else on this, because it's such useful ammo politically for people that oppose abortion like myself. And yet the left seems to be just completely ignoring it. Not saying anything, turning the other way because they know it makes their side look like what it actually is. A barbaric, evil practice that murders children for the sake of convenience. We'll take a quick break. We'll be back in just a minute.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, it's Caleb here, and I was just driving through South Alabama. I had a couple quick thoughts that I'd like to share with you. First of all, I really love it when the environmentalists tell us that there just are not enough trees, that we're killing all the trees, that there are no trees out there. As you can probably see through the window there, South Alabama is just trees. There's virtually nothing. You got maybe Andalusia, Enterprise, and Dothan, and trees, and that's pretty much it, other than Gulf Shores, which is the beach. So I genuinely believe that it should be part of our criminal justice system that any liberal that whines too much about there not being enough trees, that their sentence, their punishment for that, should be to drive through South Alabama, because they will be immediately disillusioned about this idea that there are just not enough trees left in the world. There is nothing but trees for miles and miles and miles and miles. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, and it actually made me hearken back to a comment that was made, I would say a few months ago, by Hillary Clinton, talking about how the coast, in other words, the people in California and Oregon and Washington and then New England, that they all voted for her and everybody else voted for Trump, which, is true. And then she also talks about trying to essentially explain why that is. She says that, well, all the dynamic people, all the movers and shakers and the people that are making money, those are the ones that voted for me. It was the neophytes, the little people over in flyover country that voted for Trump. And goodness knows that I'm not the world's biggest Trump supporter. I didn't even vote for the guy in the first election, but one of the reasons that she lost that election in the first place, and one of the reasons that Americans in general are just so tired of that, is because there is a large contingency of the left that genuinely believes that only people in the cities are the ones that are dynamic and important. And I'm driving through South Alabama, and right now it's mostly just trees, but especially when you get a little bit further north. I was driving through here and I noticed there's so many fields with cattle and hay, and you get a little bit further south and you're going to see an awful lot of cotton and peanuts and some soybeans. And so I really do think, and I think that this is important to remember, that though there are people in the cities that tend to vote Democrat and have never seen a farm, have never been through, quote unquote, the flyover country, I think it's incredibly important for us to remember that, yeah, they may look their nose down at people like that, but if you were to actually take one of those people and have them try to survive in an environment where there were not the people producing their food and their fiber in states like Alabama, that those cities would immediately devolve into chaos and die. And I think it's so hilarious that the people in cities look down their nose at people in the country, people in farmland, that kind of thing, and then they wouldn't even be able to begin to have a similar lifestyle that they do if it were not for those people. And maybe I'm thinking about this because I'm an ag major and state convention for the Alabama FFA is coming up. But what it really all boils down to is that whether they appreciate it or not, whether or not they understand the relationship between their life and what they're doing and people in places like this that provide the lumber for the house that they live in or the building that they work in, and provide the cotton for their clothes and provide the food that goes on their table, they would quickly learn an appreciation once that stuff went away. Once they realized that the magic bread fairy doesn't just bring bread to the supermarket, that there are people involved in the growth and production and transportation of that, I think it would really paint it in a different light. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that it's productive for us to go out and talk about how silly and stupid they are and how ridiculous their position is on that, even though there's some truth to it. I think we do better catching more flies with honey than vinegar and explain to them and talk to them and educate them about the important role of Middle America to the rest of the world, to the rest of the economy, because the reason that we are an economic powerhouse, the reason that we have so many people that don't have to be involved directly in growing their own food and wondering where their food's going to come from one day to the next. The best way to do that is through education and helping them to understand that that is an important part of it. So let's just try to come at it from a diplomatic perspective, and hopefully they'll be able to realize at that point that it's important for them to appreciate the American farmer.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
Welcome back, everybody. Today's Daily Dose of Stupid comes from Rasmussen. And by the way, Rasmussen is not the stupid one. It's the people that were being polled by Rasmussen. So I'm not blaming Rasmussen. They're actually a really good polling company. They can't help what the results are. They can't help that the answers are bad. They just ask the questions. That's really not on them, but they are the reason that we have a Daily Dose of Stupid. And so Rasmussen is I guess you could say this Daily Dose of Stupid is brought to you by them. So in this new poll that they took on sentiments towards the NRA, the National Rifle Association, of which I am a member, full disclosure, they found that 28% of Democrats said that being an NRA member should be illegal. So in other words, that would disband the NRA. I mean, effectively, that would get rid of them. So you have about 30% of one of our political parties, so that's roughly 15% of the country, that thinks it should actually be a crime enforced by law to be a part of an organization that protects gun rights. Let that sink in for a second. The NRA, for all of my misgivings about it, and there are some, the NRA has not been perfect in every respect. There have been some things that even I've been critical of them on. But they're saying now that at least a significant plurality of one of our parties in America believes that being a part of the oldest civil liberties organization in the country should be something that you should not be legally permitted to do. And when you dig into some of the other stats found by this study, it gets even more interesting. 32% of the Democrats polled said that the NRA is a terrorist organization. Now remember, what a terrorist organization is it is a group of people that use violence to strike fear into people in order to gain some kind of political reality, some type of new political shift. They're trying to create a political change through violence. That's what it all boils down to. And 32% of Democrats believe that the NRA meets the qualification for this. What's astounding to me is that we found out that people that are advocates for gun rights and people that are in the NRA, presumably, are actually some of the most law-abiding citizens that there are. Now, granted, this didn't directly look at NRA members, but I'm guessing that a pretty considerable amount of concealed carry people are NRA members, or at least in the same sort of mindset as NRA members. In a study that was done a few years ago, they found that that was the most law-abiding group of people in the country, even more so than off-duty police officers. And yet, these are the people that, according to a significant plurality of people in the Democrat Party, that those people are terrorists, including myself, by the way, and quite a few of my friends. Only 17% of Democrats said that the NRA members are more likely to commit gun crimes. Now, this to me is the most fascinating thing, that when you look at the stat that we just looked at and the stat that we have now, 32% saying that the NRA is a terrorist organization, 17% saying that NRA members are more likely to commit gun crimes. So, more likely than who? Well, than the average citizen. So what you're telling me is that 32% of Democrats say that the NRA is a terrorist organization, but only 17%, in other words, 15% less than the 32%, only 17% believe that they are more likely to engage in some kind of crime or gun violence. And that's not assuredly, that's just that they are more likely, which softens it even more. what that tells me is that there is at minimum 15% of Democrats that are saying, yep, they're a terrorist organization, but are also saying, but they're not more likely than the average person to commit crimes. What can we surmise from that? What is the logical conclusion? If you see this data, what's the only conclusion that you can reach? The only one that I can think of, the only one that you can arrive at logically, is that these Democrats that believe the NRA is a terrorist organization and do not believe that NRA members are more likely to commit violent acts or gun crimes have redefined what terrorism is. They think that it should be classified as a terrorist organization, but not because they're violent. Well, then what's the only thing left? They believe that you are a terrorist if you disagree with them. If you see the Second Amendment differently than they do, if you have a different opinion on gun ownership, gun rights, whatever, you are a terrorist. Doesn't matter that you're peaceful. Doesn't matter that you wouldn't hurt anybody. Doesn't matter that whether it's at an NRA event or any other political event, that you would never use violence to try to hurt another person and make a political change. None of that matters. The mere act of disagreeing with them on gun rights makes you a terrorist. That's the only conclusion that I can reach. Because I don't see how else that 15% difference between the people that are saying you're not more likely to commit an act of violence and are saying, but the NRA is a terrorist organization, there's no other way to arrive at that conclusion other than they've completely changed what terrorism is. And in their mind, what terrorism means is you see things differently than I do. You take a different political opinion than I do. I mean, that ought to be terrifying to anybody on either side of the political spectrum. And what's amazing about that is that a lot of these same Democrats, because I'm assuming, just based on their stance, that a vast majority of these Democrats that are saying that the NRA is a terrorist organization would be the very far-leaning, very left, the most extreme. That would be my guess. Well, if that's the case, it amazes me that a lot of the people on the very far left of the political spectrum are people that would never condemn CARE, even though they're an unindicted co-conspirator with the Muslim Brotherhood. They've actually been caught funding terrorism, and they're not a terrorist organization, but the NRA is. What about Antifa? Antifa has not only attacked random citizens and thrown bricks and Molotov cocktails into completely unaffiliated businesses just to create chaos, they've also taken over actual government facilities, held government officials hostage. They're not a terrorist organization, but the NRA is? So apparently, if you disagree with them, terrorist organization, whether you use violence or not, if you agree with them, even if you actually do engage in violence to try to create a political change, doesn't matter. You're not a terrorist. We have gotten to the point to where the word terrorist just means somebody that I don't agree with, and that should scare people. I don't agree with a lot of people on the left. Doesn't make them terrorists. Not until they actually use violence as a means to accomplish their political goals. And I say this because I think in a lot of those people's minds, the NRA is a bunch of faceless, nameless, fat cats, corporate tycoons that are super rich, that are dictating from on high. They're buying off politicians and just keeping any kind of meaningful gun legislation for going through. In their mind, I think that's really what they believe. They don't think about it being their friends, their neighbors, people that they would have no problem being around, that just happen to really like guns and like the fact that we have the freedom to own firearms in this country. They don't see them as people. And to flip this argument on its head, what's the most important thing that Unplanned did? The movie about the abortion clinic and the woman that was the employee of the year of Planned Parenthood that turned over a new leaf, saw what abortion really was, and is now a pro-life advocate. What was the most important thing that movie did? Because I think that there's a couple of different opinions on that, but in my mind, because most of the people that saw it were people that were already pro-life, or at least that's my estimation. I don't know that for sure. I think the most important thing that it did was it humanized the people that were caught up in Planned Parenthood. The main character and several of the characters that work at the Planned Parenthood clinic around her, it doesn't try to paint them as monsters. It doesn't try to paint them as horrible people. In many ways, it showed how they've been lied to by Planned Parenthood, just like a lot of the other people. Now, there are some people in Planned Parenthood that it's pretty critical of. The main antagonist of the movie is a director for Planned Parenthood. But the hero is too. And a lot of the people surrounding her that work at her clinic, they don't seem like bad people. They're wrong. It portrays them that way. But it doesn't paint them as monsters. It doesn't try to make the case that they're Nazis or something like that. And that may have been the most important thing that movie did. Because it encouraged people on the pro-life side to think differently than they're accustomed to thinking on that issue. And I hope that it bears fruit, and I think that it may have even changed my mind on that a little bit, and I'm glad that it did. Maybe I'm a little bit more empathetic and responsive to that now. But when we're looking at this, that's what needs to happen with the NRA. Even if you're completely against the NRA, think the Second Amendment ought to be completely repealed and we should basically adopt the UK model and try to have a gun-free society. I think that you're crazy as a Betsy bug and dead wrong on that, but regardless, even if that's the route that you think we need to go, there's no reason for you to demonize everybody that sees that issue differently than you. And I think that's what at least 32% of the Democrat Party has done by trying to declare a civil rights organization like the NRA as a terrorist organization. And I've seen people on the right do a similar thing. I've seen people on the right that just love to own the libs, as it were. They'd rather troll people and make them angry than actually make a point or try to change a person's mind. And it's wrong when people on the right do it. It's wrong when people on the left do it. That's why I thought what Unplanned did was so brilliant, is that it showed the other side of it. And I do know people on the right, whether it's in their Facebook post or how they interact with people, that treat other people as though they don't matter. As though if they disagree with them, they're not worthy to have a discussion with them on the issues. And that's wrong too. It doesn't matter what side it's coming from. We've got to quit demonizing one another. And I think it's appropriate that this story comes out right about the same time that 9/11 hits, where we should be remembering that for all of our disagreements, for all of the things that we may not see eye to eye on, we are all still Americans. And we'll solve a lot more problems if we keep that in mind. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Our chaplain's report today comes from a passage that I was just randomly going through. I've been reading through the Minor Prophets recently, which, by the way, I don't think enough people do. There is a wealth of information and wisdom coming from the Minor Prophets, and on the surface, they all seem kind of similar. I mean, prophet comes in, Israel's not acting right, the prophet tries to straighten them up. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but the messaging is kind of similar, talking about God's wrath being visited upon a certain group of people. And so because of that, I think that a lot of people either get bored with them or they don't want to dive too deep into them because of that. But there is so much richness contained within the wisdom of the minor prophets. And today we're going to Zechariah 7, 8 through 13. Then the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, saying, Thus has the Lord of hosts said, Dispense true justice, and practice kindness and compassion, each to his brother. And do not oppress the widow or the orphan, the stranger or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. But they refused to pay attention, and turned a stubborn shoulder, and stopped their ears from hearing. They made their hearts like flint, so that they could not hear the law and the words which the Lord of hosts has sent by his Spirit through the former prophets. Therefore great wrath came from the Lord of hosts. And just as he called, and they would not listen, so they called, and I would not listen, says the Lord of hosts. I understand that there's a lot to digest in that short little passage of Scripture, but we're going to do the best that we can to extrapolate what God is trying to say here. First of all, I wanted you to notice about these few verses. Don't they seem pretty reasonable? To you, seriously, don't they seem like reasonable requests from God? He's not even talking about doing anything spiritually complicated. He's not talking about anything that's necessarily going to be overburdensome, in the sense that he's not giving specific instructions for religious ceremonies or Sabbaths or sacrifices. That's not what God is upset with them about. What are the things that he requested of them? To do justice correctly. In other words, don't get lazy about it, don't perverse it. You do justice the way that I mean justice, the way that I want you to do justice. And then what else? Just take care of the widows and orphans. Be compassionate towards one another. Take care of one another. And don't devise evil in your hearts. You see, one thing that I notice about this passage is that as reasonable as requests as this seem, as basic as it seems, I mean, this is like the elementary level stuff when it comes to God's law and how to live a godly life. Doesn't mean it's necessarily easy, but it is very simple. You notice how he says that it always goes back to the heart? Because if you look back in this verse that we were talking about in the first few verses, where he says, practice kindness and compassion to his brother, and then he says, do not devise evil in your hearts. I mean, that's a heart issue, isn't it? That's what he keeps going back to, that all these things that you're not doing that I want you to do, and all the things that you are doing that I don't want you to do, it goes back to a matter of the heart, the intention, what you want to do, what you desire to do, what you have passion to do. Israel had a heart problem, that their hearts were no longer turned towards God. They were turned towards themselves. They were following their impulses. They were following what they wanted to do. When God is saying, this stuff isn't complicated. I didn't ask you to do some great deed. I didn't ask you to conquer some great land or anything. I'm just telling you to take care of one another and treat each other kindly. And the reason that you're not doing that, and the reason that you're devising these evil things against one another and hurting each other, is because your hearts are not right. Your heart is not open to me. It is not ready to receive my law. And because of that, these things have happened to you. There's a really powerful imagery that's used there too, you may remember. He says that their hearts are like flint. What do you know about flint? Of course, it's the stone that we use to start a fire. Do you know what's interesting about flint, though? It's very, very hard, but also very brittle. See, that's the reason that makes it ideal for starting a fire, is because it's so hard that you can scrape metal across it and it'll create sparks because there's a lot of friction created because of how hard it is. But it's also really easy to break in pieces. You can even shave little pieces of flint off if you're starting a fire and use those pieces to start it burning. So why use that as an analogy for the heart? It's not that their hearts were strong, it's that their hearts were hard. There's a big difference. Their hearts were not prepared to weather storms. Their hearts were not prepared to endure the challenges that were coming upon them. They were just immune to having it change, to having God influence their life and direct their passions and their desires. And because of that, they only followed their own passions, their own desires, didn't listen to anybody else. They were primarily concerned with what's in it for me. And that's why God says that their hearts are like a flint, because it's so easy to break. When the only concern is yourself and your own happiness, then you have a heart that's very easy to break, because let's be honest, we live in a cruel world and things don't always go our way. When our heart and our passion is turned towards God and serving His children, our hearts aren't easy to break. They endure because we see a greater purpose outside of ourselves. Even if we're not thrilled to death to be wherever we are at the moment, it doesn't matter, because we see that larger purpose. We see beyond our own desires and our own ambition. We see a plan unfolding that we get to be a part of that will last throughout all of eternity. And that's how our hearts can be soft and yet strong. The exact opposite of the kind of heart that Israel had here, that was like a flint. And so, this is the question that I leave you with. Why had they not opened their hearts to God? Why was Israel immune to God's warnings and His instruction? I don't think people have changed that much. Isn't it the same reason that we have people in the world today that are the same way? Isn't that the reason that we're sometimes like that? We hear God's word, we hear His commandments, and we think, oh, that's just too hard. That's going to be too complicated. If I start doing this now, I'm going to have to help everybody. If I start caring about this thing, I'm going to have to care about that thing. And it's just so difficult to keep up with. You don't think Israel felt the same way? I think the reason that their hearts were hardened is because they were so concerned with taking care of their own homestead, their own family, which taking care of your family is obviously a good thing, but not if you're concerned primarily with your own desires and ambition. You see, what was going on here is they made themselves immune to instruction because it was going to get in the way of what they wanted to do. And doesn't that happen to us way too often? That we think, oh, well, I probably should go to that prayer breakfast, but I just want to sleep in. Or, I should go visit that person in the hospital, but that's going to throw my whole schedule off. I probably should do something about evangelizing and sharing the gospel with somebody, but if I do that now, it's going to become a weekly thing, and it's going to be such a hassle. I really should read my Bible, but, I am binge watching Netflix, and then you do binge watch Netflix, and then you realize that you have to go to bed, and, well, I could do it now, but then I'm going to be really tired for work in the morning. So we make excuse after excuse after excuse. And that's how a heart becomes like flint. It's not strong, but it's very brittle. And if we want that kind of strength, that is a strength that only comes from having a right relationship with God. Zechariah understood it. We need to understand it now. And the reason that it's so important that we get that right is because of what happened in the last verse. You remember the last verse that we read in verse 12 and 13, that the warning was, since I called to them and they did not answer, when you call to me in prayer, times of distress, whatever it is, I will not answer. If we want a God that is going to listen to us, to understand our request, we have to turn our hearts towards Him. We can't just be like the person that only calls on God and only reaches out to Him when we feel like He can do something for us. To establish a real love and a real desire for God means to turn our hearts towards Him in the good times and the bad. And when we do that, we'll have the spiritual strength and the providence to help us through those dark times. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by